Well, I will jump into a quick welcome to everybody who's on with us. I'm Sarah Hall. I'm the director of the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, and I'm happy to welcome you to tonight's special program, Unraveling the Past. This program was planned to complement our current exhibition, Joseph Holston, Color and Freedom, Journey on the Underground Railroad, which creates a narrative through powerful images of the trauma of capture, enslavement, and escape. We've been wanting to do a deeper exploration of the complications of genealogical research for those whose family connections were ripped apart through slavery, and this is going to be a fascinating and enlightening conversation. Our panelists have such impressive backgrounds and experiences to share. I'm going to have Kelly Mealy, our Director of Education, handle the individual introductions. Before I do that, I'm going to just do a quick plug for this weekend at the museum. In addition to Joseph Holston's exhibition, we have the folks from Penns Woods Printmakers here on Sunday from 2 to 4, giving printmaking demonstrations in our atrium. So stop by, see 2 fabulous exhibitions, revisit our permanent collection, and get some hands-on printmaking experience. And thanks so much for being with us tonight. So Kelly, I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Sarah. And it is my honor to be able to introduce our wonderful speakers this evening. We will be hearing from Renate Yarbough Sanders. She is a descendant of formerly enslaved ancestors, enslavers, and free people of color. She authors 2 blogs, Into the Light and Related, and produces mostly African-American funeral programs online database. She's a member of the National Geographic Society, the North Carolina Genealogical Society, the Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Society, and Vice President Newsletter Editor for the Hampton Roads chapter, the Utah Genealogical Society, and the Tyrrell County Genealogical and Historical Society. She is also a member of the Lineage Society, Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage. Renate co-hosts Let's Talk North Carolina Genealogy, an online platform and YouTube show presenting genealogy programming and virtual events for North Carolina researchers. And she has served as a panelist and guest on numerous web shows and podcasts. Her research has been featured on PBS Radio and in National Geographic cover story and podcast. Renate has contributed to genealogical publications, and she volunteers as an indexer, transcriptionist, and photographer in the genealogy community. We will also be hearing from Jerome Spears. Jerome is a native of Baltimore, accelerated his genealogical research efforts back in 2009. His undergraduate from Morgan State University and graduate from University of Hawaii degrees in geography have served him well in assisting his approach of meticulously positioning his ancestors within the historical context of place and time in order to uncover and reveal some remarkable and amazing family history discoveries. In 2020, he used DNA methods to find and then successfully contact his own family's Kanse, in this case being from Nigeria. In 2022, he completed the arduous task of successfully visually phasing his and his 4 siblings' DNA chromosomes, which reveal at the 4 grandparents level game-changing specific and detailed genetic recombination and inheritance. As a GU-272 Susquehanna plantation and historic Sauterley plantation descendant, his regional focus continues to be nested in Maryland, with some compelling links to the US, South and Midwest, Canada, Europe, Australia, the Caribbean, and West Africa. We will also get to hear from Miller-Matema Miller. She's a cultural activist, a social artist, a family tree consultant, and lecturer. She's a retired certified Maryland World History instructor. In 2011, she developed and directed a Civil War performing company, the Poly United States Colored Troops History Society. She is president of Afrasia, the Intercultural Education Exchange, a research and education company exposing hidden intercultural relationships throughout history. She has received numerous awards for her work with Native, Asian, and African American women. For 13 years, Matema presented and performed with the Painted Gourd, red and black voices traveling primarily throughout the Northeastern states, sharing the history of Native people and Africans before, during, and after Columbus. As a descendant to the 7th generation of an enslaved personal maid to Martha Washington, Matema has designed programs of healing for both enslaved descendants and slaveholder descendants. She is the chair of the Washington County, Maryland Diversity and Inclusion Committee and a board member of the Tulsan's Historic Chapel and School. Matema attended DC Teachers College and Howard University and is a graduate of the University of the District of Columbia, where she received a BA in Psychology and Communications. She received a B and an M in Holistic Studies, and the thesis that she covered was Metaphysical Healing of Violence, a Global Challenge. Matema is certified in clinical hypnosis and with an extensive training as transactional analysis therapist. So I welcome you all. We're really excited to have each and every one of you. I am excited to hear a lively discussion. We are going to begin our discussion with Renata. Renata's going to kick it off, and then we will go through each one of our panelists. At the end, we will come back together and join in a discussion and open the floor up to anyone who wants to ask questions. Feel free to use the Q&A at the bottom and also the chat, and we will kind of, we'll check in on that as our speakers are presenting. And also speakers, at any point, you're welcome to check the chats and Q&A and jump in there at the end as well. So Renata, I'm handing it over to you. Thank you and welcome.
I should unmute. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Oh.
All right, let me just make some lessen my distractions here. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I am Renate Yarbough Sanders. I'm really pleased to be a part of this panel tonight. I will be kicking things off with just a really quick overview of doing research on ancestors of color. This, for all of us, is a very abbreviated presentation, so I will not be sharing like documents and things that in the way that I typically would, but certainly at the end, when you see my contact information, if you are interested in knowing more about anything that I talk about in my 15 minutes of fame here tonight, please do reach out and I'll be happy to talk with you further. So I want to just quickly talk about how you get started with this genealogical research. And these beginning steps are the same for anyone, no matter what your ethnicity or what the ethnicity of your ancestors that you are researching would be. And if I could just ask if everyone would mute, that would be very helpful to me. Thank you. So we all begin the same way. We begin by thinking about what we already know. And we want to document what we know about our families from the very beginning, starting with yourself, working your way backwards, using building a family tree or using a pedigree chart that starts with you, has your parents, your grandparents, and so on, as far as you know back on both your maternal and paternal side, unless you are just wanting to concentrate on one side at a time. Also, in those early steps, you want to start interviewing your family members, especially beginning with the elders, and not only the elders, but also anyone in your family who may unfortunately have a chronic illness or a debilitating disease. Anyone who you may be concerned might not be there for you to interview later. in this day and time, we all should be using audio and video recording when we're doing these interviews. And just pay very close attention to any family stories that are shared, any type of oral history that's shared with you. You will still need to research it, and you're most likely going to find that whatever the story is, it's not exactly 100% true the way it was told to you, but make sure you make note of anything you're told. And then these days, you guys are so lucky if you're just getting started, because there is a lot of information, beginner level information that's available to you on the internet. So go ahead and use all the free online access that you can to find an initial record base and start building up information about your family. And it's really important that as you're working, you start creating a timeline for each ancestor or maybe for each ancestral family. So in the beginning, you're just going to be mostly getting records about birth, marriage, death, and military records from your 20th century military involved family members and or ancestors. And then, of course, you're going to start working with the federal census, which was taken, started being taken in 1790 and has been enumerated every 10 years since then. So the most recent federal census that is available is the 1950 census. It just came out in April of this year. And what you'll do is you will start with that family line that you're researching, and you will find them in the 1950, the 40, the 30, and go all the way back through 1880. But then you get to this place that has a bad reputation with African-American genealogy research, and that is the 1870 census. It has been historically referred to as the 1870 brick wall. And the reason for that is because the 1870 census was the first federal census taken after emancipation, and therefore it's the first time that all people of color, even those who've been formerly enslaved, are going to be enumerated by name. Now, please understand that enslaved people were enumerated in the census since the very beginning in 1790. But they just were not enumerated by name. They were tick marks under categories, just like everyone was except for the head of household up until 1850, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So I don't believe in the brick wall. I don't use that term, and I'm going to show you why. So when you get to the 1870 census, you're going to want to find your ancestors and make note of all the baseline data that that census is providing for you, since this is possibly the first time they've been enumerated by name. So make note of the names they're using, the ages that are given, the location where they are, what kind of work they're doing, who's in the household with them, and all of those kinds of things. And keep in mind that formerly enslaved people did not always take the surname of their last owner. As a matter of fact, they did not even usually take the surname of their last owner. And also within families, people did not always use the same surnames. At emancipation, formerly enslaved people could choose whatever surnames they wanted to. And so don't lean on the idea that whatever last name they had must have been the name of the last owner. But before you go any further, you've gotten what you can out of the 1870. Then you should look for your ancestors in the 1860 and the 1850 census to determine if maybe they were free people of color. Because in 1850 and 1860, all free persons were enumerated by name, regardless of whether they were black, white, or yellow. Well, I shouldn't have said or yellow, because there's a little trickiness to that. So black, white, or green. Now, if your ancestors of color do not appear in either the 1850 or the 1860 census records, then the likelihood increases that they may have been enslaved. So at this point, you have to decide which way to take your research. And you have reached what I call the 1870 fork in the road. So we're going to take a look at this fork in the road, and we're going to first take a look at what is available to you in researching ancestors that you believe may have been enslaved, or maybe you have already found out that they were enslaved. Now, this is where this presentation becomes very different from anything else, because these are all the record types that in a longer presentation, I would be showing you examples of, and we would be dissecting them, and I would make sure you know how to extract the information from them. But maybe I can come back and do that for you another time. So these are just some of the record types that you will find to be extremely helpful in researching ancestors who either you know to have been enslaved or you're trying to figure out if they were enslaved. There is a document called the Federal Slave Schedules that was enumerated as Schedule 2 of the 1850 and 1860 Federal Census. I can't get into it on this presentation, but I will tell you that there are some specific ways that you can use these slave schedules, first and foremost, just to find out the names of enslavers. But please do some research about how you might use them to help with your looking for your family. Also, cohabitation records, which are marriage records, so to speak, that document slave marriages which were not legal. And so therefore, after emancipation, we had thousands of couples, hundreds of thousands of couples who had been living as man and wife, who had families together, but their marriages were not legal and their children were not legitimate. And so through an effort of the Freedmen's Bureau, as well as in some states through an act of the legislature, these couples came forth and registered themselves, and therefore we have some of those records that help us to identify couples, how long they've been together, where they were located, and that kind of thing. Now, the bulk of time spent in researching enslaved ancestors is often spent in looking at estate files and probate records. And within those files, the kind of juiciest content for us is going to be in wills, inventories, bills of sale, division of property, and sales and account papers. Also, fugitive or runaway slave ads are very valuable for helping us to document an owner to an enslaved person, an enslaver and an enslaved person. Also, if you know that the ad is about your ancestor and you've never seen a photo of your ancestor, you're going to typically get a really good description of them, sometimes with some details that can be painful and hard to read. But for me, who's never seen a photo of any of my enslaved ancestors, it would be better than nothing. Church records are very rich in finding mentions of the enslaved and notating who their enslaver was. Our churches were not segregated before 1865. Enslaved people attended the churches of their enslavers. And so those records are very rich resources. Also, newspapers, both African-American newspapers and mainstream newspapers will sometimes refer to enslaved people during slavery, but better yet, even after slavery, they will refer to someone as formerly enslaved or some other terms that I'm not going to say right here, but terms that let you know that that person had been enslaved before 1865. And then manuscript collections, which are available some online, but also through university libraries, state libraries, historical collections, historical societies. These are going to fill you with information about enslaved people and the communities that they lived in. And then the last one I'm mentioning, this list is not a complete list, but I'm going to mention scholarly works such as dissertations and journals and books that include lots of information. And again, in all of these cases, you may or may not find your own ancestors, but you will find people who lived in their communities. That's why that 1870 baseline data is so important. And you can learn about what was going on around them, even if you don't find your own ancestors. Now I'm going to whoosh right through this, but I want to say before I talk about the second set of people, ancestors of color, that there is also a very valuable record set available. It's always been available at the National Archives, but now it's available online. It's searchable on Ancestry. It's somewhat searchable on Family Search, and it's browsable in either place. And these are the records of the Freedmen's Bureau. These records, which cover the years 1865 through 1872, and a little bit before 1865, in 3 places in the country, there were some pre-Bureau records. You can just glance down this list and see what types of records and reports are available to us as researchers. And the good thing about it is that some of these documents will name a freed person and also tell you who they were formerly enslaved by. And you have to know that in order to do thorough slave ancestral research, because unfortunately, enslaved people were property. And so therefore, to find out about your property, you have to know who owned the property, because that's whose name the records will be in. The same is true for records of the Freedmen's Bank. These are 2 different entities, which both were started in 1865 by an act of Congress. And if you just glance over at this bank record for Wright Whitfield, you can see that you get information about, where he was born, where he was raised, what kind of work he's doing, who is his wife, who his children are, his parents, his siblings. So this is, if you're lucky enough to get a Freedmen's Bank record on an ancestor, your work will be done that could have taken you 20 or 25 years. It's also important that while you're doing this research that you understand the laws of the time, whichever time period you're looking at. You need to know property laws. You need to know laws of coverture. That means that has to do with the laws regarding women owning property, married women specifically. And you need to know any laws related to slavery and the Black codes. Now, as I rush to the end, I want to talk about another group of people that sometimes are overlooked when we are researching our ancestors. In 1860, almost 11% of African people in the African ancestor people in the United States were actually already free. You have to know that the status of a person followed the condition of their mother. So if a child was born to an enslaved mother, that child was born enslaved. But if a child was born to a white woman or to a free African-American woman or to a Native American woman who was free, then that child was born free. There also were free people who had been manumitted by their previous owner before the full act of emancipation. And then there were the self-emancipated, which is a nice way of saying runaway. And a lot of them, once the Civil War started, ended up in the Union Army in the United States colored troops. And also there were people in Civil War contraband camps. So lots of African ancestor people were already living free. So now we take another path. We take the path of researching free people of color. Now, very quickly, I'll just tell you, I'm going to skip this because my time is short, but this is my 3rd great grandparents and their family shown in this one is the 1850 census. So that's how I knew they were free, but I can't go over that right now. So with free people of color, you're going to find them in the same records that you would find white ancestors: court, land records, business ledgers, estate records, all of the things that you would find, you know, anybody, any free person in, you'll find free people of color. But then there are also several document types that are specific and unique to researching free people of color. So on the left, I won't even go over that list. I'll just tell you those are the ones that are the same, very much the same as researching enslaved ancestors. And I see I have a typo at the top. This should say researching free people of color. I apologize. So those are the same as the ones we just discussed. But for free people of color, there are also free Negro registers, where they had to register with the county or city that they were living in. And you find those in northern states as well as southern states. You'll find manumission documents where an enslaver has set them free. And in some places, you'll find actual certificates of freedom. You'll find apprenticeship records. There in many of the southern states, the children of free people of color were required to be apprenticed, which was a nice way of saying almost like enslaved. They actually lived with their apprentice master and worked for him or her until they reached adulthood. And this would be the case if that free family of color could not prove that they could financially care for their children. Bastardy bonds, you find lots of free people of color there. You find women of color who have called in, or white men and Black men who have fathered their children. And this was important because back then, they'd do anything to keep someone from becoming a burden on the state or the county. And so if that woman said so-and-so fathered her child, they were going to take it to court and check it out. Military records, remember that our people have been involved in every military, every war since the Revolutionary War, and there are military records and pension files to prove it. Also, abolitionist records, free people of color were assisting in the effort to help enslaved people get to freedom and fighting for that. So you will find them in those records. And also organizational records like Masonic records. You'll find free people of color there as well. And then I want to mention the importance of making connections with the family that may have enslaved, descendants of the family who may have enslaved your family, or even if you find descendants of apprentice masters, reach out and connect, because they often have more information than what you're ever going to find online or even in a library or repository. If they're holding those things in their home, you'll never see them if you don't connect with them. And as I finish, I just want to mention quickly, because I know that one of the other presenters is going to focus on this. I also strongly encourage you, if you're going to do this work, to do DNA testing and let the DNA help you discover and tell your story. So thank you very much. This is all the ways that you can contact me. You're welcome to take a picture of the screen or whatever you'd like to do. My email is yarsan@aol.com. I'm on Twitter right now as Nada Sue. My Facebook is Renate Yarbough Sanders with the hyphen, please. And then these are the two addresses to my blog. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Renate. We are now going to hear next from Jerome. So Jerome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. I think I've got my screen fired up. Let's see. Can you all see the screen okay?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So let's get the ball rolling here. So I'm Jerome Spears. I'm glad to be here. And tonight I'm coming to you as a citizen scientist, a genealogy researcher who studies people, places, and times on this place we call planet Earth. I use a lot of advanced techniques, something called triangulation. It's used to validate matches and go back in time to determine who your most recent common ancestor might be. Another advanced technique that I use is auto clustering. That's a computer generated process where you have known cousins, and those known cousins are clustered in a pool of people who you probably don't know, because they're more distant and you don't know who everyone is in that cluster. But you can use the cousins that you know to kind of associate with the ones that you don't. And that allows you to make additional discoveries in some instances. So auto clustering is a nice tool to have in your toolkit. And then there's visual phasing. This is the process where if you have multiple siblings, 3, 4, 5 or more siblings, you can determine the recombination points of your grandparents. And even without having your parent or grandparent tested, you can kind of re-engineer and work your way back, discovering the actual DNA inheritance of your grandparents, if you have enough siblings that you've tested to help in that process. Think about it like a tug of war between the grandparents at that level. They're tugging on that rope, going back and forth. And as this is a dynamic process, as they're going back and forth, those recombinations are occurring, and that's impacting and affecting how the DNA is going to be divvied down to you, the grandchild. So most people are familiar with DNA and knowing that the parents have 50%. So you're getting some from the on the paternal side, some on the maternal side. And that's kind of a generic and open and shut process. But if you can go back a level from that and get to where you can actually see how that DNA is dispersed to your 4 grandparents, or from your 4 grandparents to you, the grandchild, that's a level of specificity which it's going to be very helpful to be able to have in your toolkit if you can. And so why are we doing this? Why are we at this level? Because it's 2022. We have all of this technology, all of the resources available to do these types of things. If we were to go back to 1977, certainly Alex Haley, when he did his research, he rolled up his sleeves and was able to successfully go all the way back to Africa in the 1970s. And he didn't have any of the research advanced methodologies and tools that we have at our disposal today. And yet he was successful in his effort. He certainly inspired a lot of people in making these discoveries. And I was among that group in the 70s that was inspired by what Alex Haley was able to do. And at that point, I kind of wanted to see, could I work my way back to Mother Africa as well? Even during the years of growing up, I kind of became the de facto relative who held all of the new relatives up so that they could behold the only thing greater than themselves. So I was kind of in the family history business even before I was in the family history business, kind of informally with some of these additional duties that I had picked up. In the 1970s in Baltimore, our maternal grandparents got together with all of their children and grandchildren to tell us about their history. And we were in Baltimore, but they were from Southern Maryland, about 100 miles south of where we were in St. Mary's County. And my aunt and cousin recorded the event. We got it on cassette tape, which we later moved to CD so that we could, to this day, hear in our grandparents' own voices all of the history, the oral history that they laid down for us. And so that was a great event that happened in the summer of '79. And then the clock started ticking. Got in the Army, got married, moved around, different things happened, and the clock is going, and before you know it, 30 years went by. And you realize that, you know, life just kicks in and other things take more of the center stage. And so once I got to 2009 and realized that, man, there's a lot of work that my grandmother and that my aunt had done, and when they had the baton, and it was time to pass that baton down to me to begin my own research. And I wanted to focus on the aspects of DNA. And so I began to do all of the DNA tests. I swam in all of the lakes, or in multiple lakes, as people will say. And I used all of the third-party tools that were available. I tested all of my siblings, both of them, and I tested aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, maternal, paternal, up and down the line. You want to test as much as possible. And particularly when you're dealing with your siblings, you want to be able to use those siblings to compare and contrast some of the matches that you're looking at. That can be very, very helpful as you're going. You can't downplay the power of sibling summation and having all those siblings working with you as you're trying to make these discoveries, because DNA is the ultimate truth serum. You can use DNA if you're trying to resolve DNA questions on your father's side. 5 siblings can help you with getting those answers on your father's side. If you're trying to resolve questions on your mother's side, those same 5 siblings can help you resolve the DNA questions on your mother's side. But you can't use them in a singular way. You have to have help. So if you have first cousins, second cousins, and third cousins, particularly the second and third cousins, as it relates to even moving back beyond the parents to the grandparents, you can use those matches to tease out the DNA along with that visual phasing process that I alluded to. And you can begin to see how the DNA is dispersed and sent down to each of the grandchildren specifically. And so that's why I like to call the grandparents the Fantastic Four. It's just remarkable at that level what kind of insight you can get when you're doing DNA research. And once you're at the grandparent level, you're also just one door or one step away from the Reconstruction period, or beyond that, the period of enslavement and even the Civil War. And so to have validated, confirmed DNA hits taking you back to the grandparents and giving you some insights to help you more accurately go back even further, that's priceless. So when you're using these advanced techniques and tools, the other thing it allows you to do is to be a more efficient researcher, because if you're looking at specific DNA on specific chromosomes tied to a specific grandparent, you can then isolate the other 3 grandparents that aren't involved in that particular match and go specifically through door number 1 for a Spears match, or specifically through door number 3 for a Jordan match. And it makes you a more effective and efficient researcher. So being able to validate your DNA is just a priceless thing to be able to have available and working in your favor as you're doing your search for your family members. I like to call myself a walking ethnicity rainbow coalition. But what do I mean by that? My DNA is all over the place. It's predominantly African, but it's all over the place. As that ancestry accounting shows, my DNA goes to Africa. It goes to Europe. It goes to the Caribbean. It goes to Canada. It goes down under to Australia. And of course, there's an indigenous component in North America. And so I regard myself as an American of triracial descent, predominantly African. When I'm looking at my DNA, and my DNA as it's dispersed from the 4 grandparents on a family tree fan, and one level behind them, the 8 great-grandparents, by using visual phasing and other advanced tools and techniques, you can begin to tease out and see some of these matches and identify specific people that are going back generations along specific lines. And it's really just an invaluable process to get to that level of specificity. I would much rather be able to look at my siblings' footprints, the unique and individual footprints along the chromosomes in this manner, the 4D manner, if you will, as opposed to just saying, I got 50% from mom, 50% from dad, and going from there. So to have those footprints of your grandparents up and down the line for all your siblings, for all the chromosomes, that takes you to a whole different level. And I would say the stars are not out of your reach once you're at that point. In 2015, I did a manuscript detailing my 8 great-grandparents. And I now have to, because of some of the DNA discoveries, I have to go back to that, dust that off, and do some rewrites, some updates, because of some of the DNA discoveries that have come into view in more recent time. And so that's a good news story to have, really, knowing that you've got more information that you have to work with now because of some of your inroads into the DNA environment. The DNA that you get, that's the hand that you are dealt. When those grandparents are done with the recombinations and send that inheritance down to you, that footprint is yours for the duration. That's the DNA that you're going to have, which in turn is going to go to the people that come behind you. So you have to play with the hand that you're dealt, and that's the level of detail that you're going to have and what's going to be available to you as you're moving down into the future. And so there's goodness in being able to do that. So I answered just a couple of questions. One, how do folks trace their roots? Well, again, it's 2022. Use all of the available documentation and historical approaches that are available, but also incorporate, if you can, DNA into your analysis. You can't go wrong with having that on the table. How do African Americans trace their roots back to Africa? I'll just use 3 tests as an example: the mitochondrial test, the autosomal DNA test, and the Y-DNA test. Mitochondrial DNA can be taken by either daughters or sons. It goes back along the mother's line for thousands of years. The Y test can just be taken by the sons, and that goes up the father's line for thousands of years. And then the autosomal test is the ones where you can test for your aunts and cousins and things of that nature. Doesn't go back as far in terms of what a Y and mitochondrial can do. So to address this roots back to Africa question, I'll spend a little bit more time on autosomal and Y-DNA. For the Y-DNA process, I've gotten one of my St. Mary's County cousins to take the Y-DNA test. He's 100 miles south in St. Mary's County. He took the test, and we can see that his results go through his line coming up the ladder. And here I am in Baltimore, 100 miles north of him. I've also taken the test, and working up through my line, we converge at John Allen Spears. This EM2 haplogroup designation is an exact match and confirmation that we're both descending from the same patrilineal ancestor. This would be John Allen Spears, who was enslaved in St. Mary's County during the Civil War era, but that EM2 designation goes all the way back to Africa. Here's a haplotree, which kind of gives you an idea of all of the mutations that a Y-DNA haplogroup can do, going back many, many generations, thousands and thousands of years. And so here's that EM2 designation that my cousin James and I got from Family Tree DNA. But again, you want to swim in multiple lakes if you're able. There's processes that you can use with Ancestry and in conjunction with Y-Seq to get some additional information about your Y haplogroup. You can also go to 23andMe and get an answer from them. And again, it's all giving you the same kind of answer. It's just further down the line on the Y haplotree. Looking at it graphically, that EM2 designation ends up having me in the Red Sea area in the Egypt and Sudan area with the Family Tree DNA result. But then as we move further forward in time, the migrations took place by going across the body of Africa and ending up all the way in the Senegal region on the Atlantic. And so these are the tangible identifiers of the lands of my fathers as identified by Y-DNA. As it relates to autosomal, the small segments that are going to be the way you're going to get to your African DNAs, because the gap between those African ancestors is going to be several generations back, such that only small DNA segments are most likely going to be what you're going to pick up as you're trying to use autosomal to get hits in that regard. But the gap can be bridged. There's a body of people that are out there that want to throw out the 6 and 7 centimorgan segments. It's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, I like to say, and I'm not in that camp. My view is that all segments aren't going to be false positive if they're small, and certainly all of them aren't going to be home runs with the bases loaded. we have to kind of be sophisticated enough to get into this gray area in the middle and work smartly in this area so that we're not throwing out what would otherwise be useful small segments to make some of these discoveries. If we do it smartly, we can get back to Africa. Can we determine the ancestors' tribe? Well, if you go into all the other work of doing the research and finding these people, well, then once you find them, then just ask them what tribe they're from. So I could ask Tolerunju, what's your tribe in Nigeria? I can ask Salman, what's his tribe in Liberia? I can ask Muhammad, what's his tribe in Senegal? I can ask Roy, what's his tribe in Liberia? So certainly there's other methods to try to get at some of those answers, but I would say go through the steps of contacting these people and then just ask them point blank yourself. It can be done. When people want to say, no, it's a bridge too far, you can't get there from here, just take a deep breath, exhale, and tell them you're using all of the modern research that's available, and you believe, yes, we can. Continue to do your research. We're doing this for the youth. We've got to make sure we're passing this down to the next family historian. We want to put the baton in somebody else's hand. Yes, doing distant African cousin research is not difficult. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. Just like endogamy can be challenging, where all the ancestors are clustered in one area. So those can be challenging things to overcome. But if you're using some of these advanced techniques and methods in tandem, you can balance the scale and get to some very positive answers. So I'll stop here, but just know that the search continues, and the more we dig, the more we find. Looking forward to answering any questions you have in the back end, and we'll pass it on from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerome. That was wonderful. We are going to hear from ZSun-nee next. I'm going to try a couple things out, so bear with me. I'm sharing a screen as ZSun-nee speaks. So I want to make sure that you can see her and not me while that presentation is happening. So just bear with me for one moment. And I'm going to share my screen first. Okay. But now I'm going to pin you, ZSun-nee. I'm still seeing me. I'm looking at our Facebook feed as I'm speaking, just to make sure. It's sometimes
Kelly, you
it's a
can,
trial and error type of thing.
Kelly, change the view
so it might be okay.
Kelly, change the view to speaker, and then it should highlight her when she's speaking.
Thank you.
Oh.
Well, it actually does not give me that option, but I removed my face and I pinned you, ZSun-nee, and I think this is working. I'm looking at our Facebook feed and I'm seeing it. So when you speak, your face should appear and we should be good. Thank you all for bearing with me there for a moment. Go ahead, ZSun-nee. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hello, friends. Listen, let's have a little conversation. There's a lot to be said. You've heard from two wonderful speakers who are researchers and who are truly invested in what they have been doing to bring family histories to light. And I have taken some of those steps. So I'm going to talk to you mostly, though, about knowing who you are. And I'm going to begin with something I call somewhat facts. You know, we all are who we are because mostly we've been assigned some type of social or cultural status. And knowing that, we live our lives that way. So what we try to do is to talk with our families. We try to get some kind of history on our ancestors, and we begin to ask questions. So doing all of that, we finally come to DNA. Now, I know there are people out there who are thinking, well, I've heard several things. I don't know. It's sort of controversial sometimes dealing with DNA. And I'm not an expert on DNA, so I can't get into that squabble, but I do know that it does exist. What I think I did in terms of tracing my family, at least on my father's side, my mother's side was already given to me. I don't know, they knew their history all the way back to 100 years in Alabama with Choctaw people and so much else. And I'm not going to go there because I want to let you know that I have followed what you just heard given to you by two experts in genealogy on how to trace your family. It took me, I guess it's been since 1989 that I have been researching my ancestors at Mount Vernon to find a woman named Caroline Branham, who was a personal maid to Martha Washington. And along the way, I could tell you so many things that will happen that you didn't expect in honestly trying to do what both of these two scholarly people have done. People who, as you approach them for information, will quickly throw you off or make it seem as if you perhaps are in the wrong place when you really are in the right place. And I can't think of why that would be except for what you can imagine. So all of that is good, and you have to exercise that before you get to other things. Now, the DNA began to show me some things that I don't know, I didn't expect some of the things I saw. I expected Africa. I expected Europe. I didn't expect some of the other things that I saw. At the same time, I was co-producing, co-hosting a program on XM satellite called The Talking Feather. And we had a very strange and unique call one day. We had a guest who was from the Census Department. And this young man called and he said that he was indigenous to the Americas, especially North America, and that he was Black. So we were like thinking, well, maybe has that a little bit mixed up. But to make a long story short, we eventually asked our guest from the Census Bureau, did she know of any people who were Black or African who were indigenous to North America or the Americas? And she said for North America, yes, that they did know. And we were shocked because the first question I would have is the same one you would have. Well, why is it that we don't know about that? Well, you mean there were communities built by these people and nobody knows anything about it? Of course, we do now. We're beginning to learn now. But there are challenges that you're going to find. And that's just along the way. But the DNA begins to show you some places that you didn't expect, such as the Iberian Peninsula. I asked myself, what was I doing? What were my ancestors doing there? I'm not too sure. And then I remembered I'm going to the next part of my talk, memory clues. Now, when I was a child, and I say this because my world is a complete blend of my metaphysical sense of things, my historical sense of things, and artistic, creative, so much more. But I remembered that when I was a child, my grandmother, who I called Baba, and no one knows why, because her name was Margaret. I don't know where I got that from. And one day she had me at the little corner store. Now, I don't know if you know much about African-American communities back in the day, as they would say, but many of them were owned and run by Jewish people. And she had me there in my stroller. And as she was talking with me, I was what she thought babbling. But instead of babbling, the store owner said, who has taught this child to speak Jewish, a Jewish language? Who's taught her that? And my grandmother said, no, we don't know. She's just babbling. We don't know what exactly she's saying. We didn't know that. And he said, oh, no. This child is speaking. She's speaking. She's not babbling. And my grandmother has repeated that story, but she's passed now. She's probably telling it wherever she is in heaven or wherever. She repeated it many, many times. And I kept it in the back of my head, but then I also monitored my dreams from the time I was a child. And I began to see other things in those dreams that today history has reflected a truth. And most of them did come from what I would call a Hebrew or Jewish background. So now I'm really dumbfounded. You know, where's this all coming from? Well, the more I did research, the more I began to find that the Jews were expelled from Judah into Babylon, according to the Bible, as punishment for not following, I guess, the ways of the people that were there. And this was in 586 BC. Now, if you're like me, dates, you hear them, but they pass right over you, which is why I always taught my students, look at relationships, because that's where your history is going to come from. The dates are important, of course, because they set a timeline for you. But if you want to know how things happened, it's usually between two people with opposing values or challenging values. So I began to see that, and I thought, now wait just a second. Okay, so the Jews were expelled from Judah to Babylon. Okay, well, what happened to them? Well, apparently they, of course, migrated all over the world, but they, especially a lot of them went to Spain. Okay, Iberian Peninsula began to come into my mind as I'm reading this, along with a lot of ooh and ahs and that kind of thing. And it seems that when they came to Spain, of course, a few trickling in are okay, but when an onslaught of people come in, it sort of changes the direction that people have or want for their own country. We see that in our country today, so you can understand it. People haven't changed, so it's the same. So they stayed, and at some point, they were given a heavy demand because it seems that the Catholic sense of things was really opposed to the Hebrew and Israelite point of view. And we can see that because, of course, there was no Jesus in the Hebrew or Israelite text or understanding. That's another show right there. But at any rate, they decided to begin with the Inquisition. This was a way of forcing people who did not have the same beliefs, as most of you probably already know, into death or out of Spain. And that began on November 1st, 1478, and it lasted until 1834. I was surprised it lasted that long. The next thing we know is that the people who were sent to Spain, well, then went on to Portugal. And so the Portuguese were the same way. A few of you were okay, but you're going to come, in droves. No, we had to do something with you, and they did. They received them, and then they sent them on, allowing some of them to be the on-street vendors. Isn't that interesting? Vendors, young children were taken and placed in poorhouses, and many of them found themselves on the street. Some of them were transported to England, and then eventually on to America. Many of them were indentured servants. Now we're talking about Black people now. I know when you hear Jews, you're thinking, oh, you have an image in your head, because that's really all we've been given. And it's a shame. It's an absolute shame, because it's not the truth. So we have all of these people of color, and they were described as Black or I'm trying to think of the other colors, but deep browns and that kind of thing. Of course, they weren't all the same color, but still, we knew this: they weren't white. So we saw all of these people being received and then wanting to move on somewhere. So a lot of the people from Portugal were put in ships and moved on into West Africa. So I got kind of excited behind that. I thought, wait a minute, because the African blood I have is coming from West Africa, some from East, but mostly from West Africa. And what did they do? Okay, they were soon picked up and brought as enslaved people into the Americas. Now, you can please go to the next slide because I'm sorry, I forgot to say that. I got so engrossed in what I was saying about things. What you see here is another memory, but something that's very true that came in my DNA, and that was a reaching back to the Yucatan Valley and the Mayan people. And it just so happened coincidentally, but there are no coincidences, that you will reach back and somehow it will be brought into your present state, people who will relate to you or who you need to meet, so that you'll say, oh, okay, so this is why this has happened. These people were all Mayan, descendants of Mayans, and we were in a theater group together. I never thought that would happen, but it did. Next slide, please. Sorry. This, of course, is what we can consider. We know this happened, where we have people who were both African American and Native. And I want to hold that picture right there for a minute, because when the young man spoke with us on the Talking Feather XM satellite show, it held in my mind that, yes, there are images of Native people who are very dark. And this particular painting has been created in order to show the diversity within the African and the indigenous Native American family. So that happened. You can go to the next slide, I think, at this time. I can't. And then you realize that that's not the only thing, only little mix that they had there. Absolutely not. Because when all of these descendants of Jewish people from the land of Judah into Spain, and those that refused, of course, were killed through the Inquisition, and those that went on into Portugal, and those that were kidnapped and taken to England and still arrived as indentured servants. A lot of indentured servants were people of color. We don't even see that. Have you ever seen that? I've never seen it, but it was very true. You look at the boat, the ship records, and there are the descriptions giving the color, the ethnicity, and how tall they were, a physical description. And so anyway, you have another group, boatloads of people by the thousands that were going into West Africa to be taken on into the Americas as enslaved people. So you see, when they say people came from Africa, it doesn't mean that they had not enjoyed other cultures and other ethnic values that were not necessarily indigenous to Africa, though of course they were associated, and they were also probably evolved and gave, I would imagine, to the Hebrews and Israelites quite a bit to work with, if you want to look at it that way. Okay, so we're now looking at who are people we consider African Americans, because that's what most of us who look like me, who are brown or of any shade of brown, so we look like, and this is what we're assigned. We may make the case that yes, we have some Native American ancestry as well. People often ask me, oh, I see, you have a Native American ancestry, you're African American, but with Native American ancestry. And I want to tell them, no, I could just very well be Native American with African ancestry, because there's so many mixtures, as Jerome has pointed out already. So here we are now. We are a multitude of people who not only are Black, white, and European, but just the cultural and ethnic context that we share is to be respected. Because I now know, this is not the show to talk about all the dreams and things that I have had, but really, I know somewhere along the line, my ancestry was involved with the Hebrews and Israelites. I didn't need them to tell me in DNA that I had something to do with those lands. I knew it intuitively instinctively through my dreams. And many of you should also pay attention to your dreams and to things that are coming into your life. Who is being attracted into your life? Which groups of people? Where do you feel some symbiotic kind of, connection with people? So this is where we're going. And believe me, we're going to see a lot of this because it's catching on. People are learning about it. I'm certainly not the only one. A lot of people are understanding now that a lot of people that you see who you think are African American on the everyday boulevards of America are actually descendants of the ancient Hebrews and Israelites. I had friends who came from some parts of North Dakota and South Dakota who were Native people who came into Washington, D.C. and asked me and other friends who were also had Native American blood and culture. They asked us, oh, what are all of these Native people doing here? Well, I didn't know Washington, D.C. had all these Native people here. And we we said, well, no, wait a minute. This was back in the day before I knew all of this, African Americans. And the Native people said, no, they're not. I know Native American features when I see them. So you see, it's that we've been told who we are. So knowing who you are, taking somewhat facts, and the two speakers before me have told you exactly how to do all of that. I've been to the courthouses. I've been to everything they've said, all the research for what, 30 years? That's too much time to even talk about, but for 30 years at least. And it's valuable, but it's not the only way that you know. Timelines, great, sort of gives you an idea of what's going on. But the last word comes not just from your research of your family, but also of a truth that you know, a truth that you feel, what and who you attract into your life. So I want people to understand that when they hear that the first African American or African people who came in 1619 in Jamestown. Oh, no, because we were being transported. Our ancestors were being transported into the Americas as early as 1585. I mean, we've been around. We were in America before the colonies were formed. There are a lot of things that we are accepting without doing the research, or we're doing the research following how we have been assigned our cultural status, because we didn't know how to think outside of that, because we didn't think it had anything to do with us, but it does. So here I am, a living, breathing person with, as Jerome has said, and Renata has said as well, with all kinds of bloodlines running through. And it's not so much the bloodlines, it's the cultural references that it gives me to let me know that that's why. So that's why I felt that way. So that's why I've been performing all over the place for all of those years of my other two partners, talking about the history of African and Native people and how they came together before, during, and after Columbus. That's what it was, and I want you to hear it, because it isn't going to be a where to go, because I've already been to the where to goes. And I've found out that when you get there, sometimes I've had some people sitting behind the information desk to laugh. And I've had to ask them, why are you laughing? Have I done something to you to make you feel that, am I doing something wrong? What's going on? And for them to only say, well, man, we're just laughing at you because you're trying so hard to look for every little detail and fact about your ancestry. And we know that there are plenty of people that just come in with the same last name as someone they think was on the Mayflower, and they use that as proof and are taken right into many of these historical organizations. And I don't care. I just sort of sigh, because wow, I wish that it wasn't that way. But I continued, and I found many, many facts that are now available to Mount Vernon. So it's all in what you are led to do. So, that's about it for me. I just want to thank you all for listening, because we've given you a lot. And I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, friends.
Wow, well, thank you. And thank you all so much for joining this panel discussion. I want to open the floor up if there are any questions. I also want to introduce who I didn't introduce in the beginning, Daniel Falco, our curator. I know that he also had some follow-up questions as well, just to kind of inspire people to ask other questions as they're watching. If you missed part of this event, we are recording it and we will be making it accessible to anybody who'd like to go back and review or catch somebody they didn't catch. But anyway, welcome, Daniel. I'm going to hand it over to you for some questions.
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. And thank you to our speakers. That was very interesting. And thank you for your diverse perspectives. One question that I had is that was related to the formerly enslaved persons who did not keep their slave owners' names. If they decided to choose another name, did they name it after a place, or was there a particular kind of name that they would choose instead of what they may have had before?
I can say something about it, although I think Renata has her hand up, and I know I was just going to talk about my family, and I know that they chose what they worked with, which was cotton in the case of my family, although she will tell you how some of them seem to come with their last name. That I don't understand, but Renata, I'm getting out of it now because the floor is yours.
Well, I was just going to say that there's no hard set rule about how formerly enslaved people chose their names. So there's way too many ways than I can list. But I will tell you that quite often you'll find that they take the surname of a previous owner or the owner, because many enslaved people had more than one owner. It may have been an enslaver who was their parents' enslaver. There's just so many ways that can go. They also sometimes, just as ZSun-nee was saying, they took like an occupational name like blacksmith, carpenter. You'll see that quite often. Some took the name Washington or Lincoln. So it just really varied. I have a talk that I give called We Were Supposed to Be Neils, because my great-grandfather, who was enslaved for 25 years, did take the surname of his last owner, which is only happens about 15% of the time. But that's because he was separated from his family at a young age, and the rest of his family remained with the Neils, which was the original owner. And so there's no other Yarborough line that we're related to. All of the Yarboroughs I'm related to descend from my great-grandfather Calvin because he chose the Yarborough name. The rest of the people that we are related to, and it's been proven through DNA, that's what my talk is about, are Neils. So there's just a wide variety of ways that names could be chosen. And yes, some did already have surnames during enslavement, but they didn't have to keep those surnames. So a lot of times you will find an ancestor with using a certain surname in the 1870 census. And I think that's because in many cases, it's the first time they've even been asked for a surname. So they just, whatever came out, but then they changed their name. And when you find them in 1880, they have a completely different surname. So that happened also.
Very interesting.
There is something else to add to that. There were many people, Sephardic Jews who came over, who were described quite melanated, and some of them had children by indigenous women, and they gave them their last names which tend to be when you look it up, Jewish names. So there's I know that that's true. There's a variety of everything because, you know, there was so little that you could say. You had to go along with the guidelines of the society. But I do think that had a lot to do with it also.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And this question is for Jerome. In terms of going about the DNA, do you, when you're ready to do that, if somebody were ready to do that, do you go to a hospital or a specific kind of medical center to do that kind of testing? Could you say a little bit more about that?
So there are several testing companies that are available on the market now. And so, you can kind of just go out on the web and get some of the names of some of the front runners, Ancestry.com, Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, Living DNA. There's another one that I probably should, My Heritage, I think it's the other one. Yeah. And so any of those companies will, for a fee, we'll send the test to your home, and you can take the test and send the kit back in and get your results that way. I always advise people, they do sales quite often. So why spend the full price when you can just wait for a Veterans Day or Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever the given holiday might be, where they'll lower the price some and, save a little money and get the test on sale, put it in the mail and wait for your results.
Okay, so it sounds relatively streamlined once you go ahead and you start doing that. Neat. Before I ask any other questions, do any of our attendees want to ask any questions? Feel
I
free
haven't
to.
seen anything yet in the Q&A or anything like that. If we have questions, since we are going to be having this replayed later, we are recording this, and if somebody's watching this at a later time, feel free to contact me. I'll put it in the chat bar, but also I'll say it out loud. I'm WCMFA. You can get on our website and email straight from our website, but you can get a hold of us and we can contact our panelists as well, and see if we can get some follow-up questions. I'm Kelly Mealy, Director of Education, educator at WCMFA.org. So you can contact me directly as well, but I'll put that in the chat. And I know we have limited time. We've got about 5 more minutes. I know, Renata, you have another program that you're doing, which is wonderful as well. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask. And go ahead, Daniel.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. One of the things actually I wanted to say is, when you were talking about this, we had an exhibition last year on the artist Joshua Johnson, who's one of the first African-American portraitists. And some of those resources that you were talking about, Renata, that is newspapers, manumission records, that came up in my research and my colleagues' research that we did for the catalog and for the show in general. Joshua Johnson being a painter from Baltimore who painted relatively affluent white patrons. And it was very interesting looking at that, because the Maryland Center for History and Culture has his manumission papers. And I was immediately thinking of that when we displayed those manumission records in the newspapers. But he remains a mystery in terms of where he came from before that. And there is research that remains to be done on, did Joshua Johnson's children leave behind any records? He was freed in the year 1782, but he had been enslaved before that. So his story is very interesting, and it gets into genealogy and those things in Baltimore and in Maryland. But we still haven't been able to determine where he came from before, where his family came from in the 1700s. Do you have any ideas of how we might trace his roots if we were to
Um,
try.
Yeah, I think just going back to those resources that I mentioned, and you said he was manumitted at a certain
Yes,
point.
he
And
was.
have you seen manumission papers?
Yes,
So you know where he was at that time. So, and you know who the enslaver was?
yes, we do.
So what you'll have to do is research the records of that enslaver and his family or her family, and see if you can find a path of ownership, because within that family, there could have been wills or inheritances or deeds of gift. You know, you don't know until you start looking, but you have to look for those things. And then within those records, you possibly could see something like, you know, Renata, child of Mary Ann, you know, so that's going to be a hint to you. Or you might find something that has a family group, because one of the things that I have found from the 1790 through the 1840 census periods is I have found in a lot of manuscript collections and family papers where the enslaver has listed out his enslaved population with their names and their ages, and sometimes in family groups, and then tallied them in preparation for having to give that information to the census enumerator. Because from 1790 to 1840, as I mentioned in the presentation, everyone, white, black, whatever, was just a tick mark. So you would have to say how many white males under 10 but older than 5, how many enslaved persons under 15 but older than 11, you know, that kind of thing. And so they're just tick marks. So the census taker, I mean the enslaver, had to be prepared for that for when the census taker came around. So you may find those kind of records extant in family papers. It's hit or miss, you know, either they're there or they're not there. So all of the things that we teach people to look for, not every person is going to find those things for their ancestors. Half of the things I showed you, I don't have for my ancestors, but I had to look for them, you know. People talk a lot about Freedmen's Bureau records as if everyone's going to find their ancestors in the Freedmen's Bureau. You're not. You're not. But if you're one of the lucky ones, or that, like that Freedmen's Bank record that I showed you, oh my goodness, I would give anything to have that about one of my ancestors, but I don't. So you just have to run the gamut of what's available, and you have to go in person. It's not all online.
Thank you.
I just want to say that, oh, sorry, Mr. I just want to say that I was lucky only because my father's people were a part of George Washington's estate. And of course, the light shining on him enabled me to shine light on my ancestors as well. And so that was a lucky break, but he was one of those that detailed every single thing. If you had a button, you notice today that Frank had one button instead of 2 buttons that were fastened. I don't know how the man did it, but he kept it with all of that. But I think that that's the point, that she's absolutely right about that. And just be ready for surprises, because if in fact your ancestors became part of the genetic family of the enslavers, you may have a little more trouble. You may find it in records where what would you call articles were written, or maybe some other kind of written material is found. But here's where you're going to get stuck. When you attempt to go to those families and say, listen, this is what I just found. You know, my ancestor and your ancestor had a child, and that child is my ancestor. That's where you may get stuck, because that's when they may deny that they know anything about it and will not be helpful. You know, and so that, expect that as well. I've seen it all. I've seen it all. Yeah.
Yeah, it goes both ways. It's, you know, sometimes the person is going to be more than ready to help and get involved and engaged with you with the research. And sometimes, like she said, they're just not going to want anything to do with it, or they'll be angry, or, you know. I made a Facebook post one time about one of my European ancestors, and this lady started a real uproar about it because he was her husband's ancestor, wasn't even her ancestor, and, you know, was very possessive, like I didn't have a right to,
That's right.
you know, post, and he's my third great grandfather, you know, and he was like her husband's like second great uncle twice removed or something like that, but he's my direct third great grandfather. And it just became a real mess within the group that this was happening in. And, you know, nobody owns our ancestors. If they're your ancestors, they're your
That's right.
ancestors. So
That's
we all
right.
have a right to speak about them,
That's right.
whether it's good, bad, or ugly.
Mhm.
Well, I hope this was really insightful for a lot of people, and I'm glad that it's live. I'm glad that we're recording it, and I'm glad people can have access to this at a later time as well. It was so interesting, and to hear you dive so deep in so many different places that you each took it, and then kind of bringing it all together here at the end with Daniel's questions. So thank you all so much. This was amazing. So
Fascinating.
Thank you for having us. It's been a
Thank
pleasure to
you.
be a part of it.
Your
Have a good
cupcake.
night.
Thank you.
have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.